The contemporary landscape of interactive entertainment is currently experiencing a profound paradigm shift, marked by the arrival of real-time neural rendering technologies that fundamentally alter how visual data is generated, processed, and perceived. NVIDIA's introduction of Deep Learning Supersampling 5 represents what many industry executives characterize as a generative watershed moment for computer graphics, transitioning the medium away from traditional handcrafted rasterization toward a model where pixels are infused with algorithmically predicted lighting and material properties. On paper, the promise of this technology is staggering, claiming the ability to effortlessly triple or quadruple effective frame rates on modern displays without the brute force computational overhead traditionally required by high-fidelity native rendering. Yet beneath the corporate marketing presentations and triumphant frame counter metrics lies a massive structural mechanical tax that threatens to fracture the foundational relationship between player input and on-screen reality. While these advanced neural injection systems succeed in creating an environment that feels visually hyperfluid, they simultaneously introduce an architectural decoupling that leaves the physical responsiveness of the game loop lagging far behind its aesthetic representation. To fully pass the mechanics of this technical bottleneck, one must look closely at how the pipeline of frame generation has evolved from simple post-process spatial scaling into a hyper-complex multi-frame neural injection engine. In older iterations of upscaling technology, the graphics processing unit focused primarily on taking a lower resolution native frame and using machine learning models to infer missing pixel density before outputting the final image to a monitor. Modern systems, however, do not merely stretch or sharpen existing pixels, they actively synthesize entirely new visual buffers out of thin air, interpolating them sequentially between natively rendered frames. When a system engages a high-order multi-frame generation multiplier, up to 75% or more of the visual data displayed on the screen is the product of predictive mathematical vectors executed by onboard tensor cores rather than direct computations derived from the game's actual internal simulation state. The display is no longer a real-time window into a deterministic virtual environment. It is a highly sophisticated generative illusion that operates on probability and learned motion behaviors rather than immediate raw state execution. This architectural shift manifests as a core engineering crisis known as decoupled latency, a structural divide where the graphics rendering pipeline and the core game simulation engine operate in completely isolated temporal realities. In a traditional rendering environment, every frame displayed by the monitor corresponds directly to a discrete tick of the game engine, meaning that physics processing, artificial intelligence loops, spatial coordinates, and player inputs are calculated in synchronous lockstep with the visual update.
When neural injection is introduced to hit a target of 180 Hz, the graphics hardware artificially inflates the visual update frequency while leaving the underlying simulation completely unaffected. As a consequence, the game engine may still be crawling along at a sluggish baseline of 45 frames per second, calculating world states and polling controller inputs at a pace native to a much slower experience. The player is caught in a mechanical paradox, looking at an ultra-smooth, high refresh rate presentation while physically interacting with a game world that is mechanically trapped in a low-performance past. The practical fallout of this decoupling is felt most acutely in titles that rely heavily on competitive twitch mechanics, sub-millisecond muscle memory, and high-frequency tactile precision. In standard native rendering, a higher frame rate naturally reduces input lag because the time delta between an action and its visual confirmation shrinks symmetrically. With neural frame generation, this correlation is entirely shattered. The additional frames synthesized by the AI are inherently retrofitted or predicted based on historical motion vectors, meaning they cannot contain or reflect any input data received after the native frame was processed. If a player adjusts their aim or executes a rapid defensive command during an interpolated frame, that input cannot be registered until the next true native frame occurs, resulting in a distinct visual mismatch where actions feel floaty, imprecise, and strangely disconnected from the velocity of the image. The immediate tactile feedback that forms the bedrock of competitive immersion is sacrificed on the altar of cosmetic smoothness, transforming a sharp interactive experience into an asynchronous spectator sport where the player is effectively chasing a predictive ghost. To combat this inherent lag penalty, hardware architects deploy specialised low-latency software suites, such as low-latency reflex systems designed to minimise frame queues and optimise driver-level scheduling. While features like frame warp reprojection and dynamic queue clearing attempt to bridge the temporal void by realigning input polling with the display's actual refresh cycles, they are ultimately fighting against an immutable physical constraint. The computational act of executing a deep transformer network model across multiple high-resolution buffers introduces a non-negotiable processing overhead within the silicon itself. No matter how aggressively a driver bypasses standard operating system bottlenecks, it cannot negate the fact that neural prediction requires a finite window of time to ingest motion vectors, calculate pixel probability fields, and reconstruct optical flow maps. This hard processing tax ensures that while low-latency software can mitigate the worst symptoms of input delay, it cannot fundamentally replicate the instantaneous responsiveness of an equivalent natively rendered frame rate.
This structural trade-off underscores a broader economic and thermodynamic pivot occurring within the silicon manufacturing industry, where brute force transistor scaling is rapidly giving way to architectural efficiency driven by artificial intelligence. For decades, the performance trajectory of graphics hardware was dictated by Moore's law and the ability to pack more physical shaders onto a piece of silicon to execute raw mathematical rasterization. As physical manufacturing boundaries shrink toward atomic limits and thermal design power envelopes reach unsustainable thresholds, expanding raw hardware performance has become prohibitively expensive and inefficient. Silicon designers have realized that it is far more efficient from a power per watt perspective to deploy specialized neural processing blocks executing FP8 tensor math to guess what a scene should look like, rather than expending the massive electrical energy required to actually calculate every ray tracing bounce or vertex transformation by hand. Generative illusion has become the primary mechanism for maintaining the appearance of generational performance leaps, shielding the consumer from the reality that raw hardware progression is encountering a hard physical wall. The widespread adoption of this generative philosophy introduces a dangerous moral hazard into the software development ecosystem, shifting the burden of game optimization away from the game studio and onto the graphics card manufacturer. Historically, game developers were forced to spend months profile testing their software, tightly managing memory budgets, optimizing culling algorithms, and streamlining draw calls to ensure their titles ran acceptably on baseline consumer hardware. Today, the immediate availability of multi-frame neural injection encourages a culture of systemic complacency, where studios can release fundamentally unoptimized code under the explicit assumption that deep learning upscalers will lift the performance floor to a playable standard. When a game requires a high-end graphics card running aggressive performance tier upscaling just to maintain a stable baseline of 60 perceived frames per second, the technology has ceased to be an optional enhancement and has instead become an architectural crutch that masks deep systemic inefficiencies in the game's core engine architecture. Furthermore, this reliance on neural reconstruction alters the very nature of visual fidelity, introducing an entirely new category of aesthetic artifacts that can actively erode player immersion. While modern transformer-based models are highly adept at suppressing the coarse shimmering and ghostly trailing artifacts that plagued early iterations of spatial upscaling, they remain fundamentally detached from the underlying game logic. Because the neural network is interpreting scene semantics based on visual patterns rather than concrete engine data, it can misread complex overlapping geometries, rapid alpha-blended particle effects, and high-frequency user interface elements.
This disconnect creates a subtle, psychological, uncanny valley of motion, where a scene may look breathtakingly detailed in static shots, but begins to feel structurally unstable, warped, or subtly plastic the moment high-speed camera panning is introduced. The player's subconscious easily detects this discrepancy, recognizing that the hyper-detailed environment they are observing lacks the physical rigidity and deterministic permanence expected of a real, tangible space. This friction between visual presentation and mechanical substance directly mirrors the macroeconomics of modern franchise management, where publishers routinely look for technological shortcuts to bridge ballooning production timelines and soaring development costs. As the engineering windows for flagship intellectual properties extend toward a decade, companies find themselves trapped in a high-stakes race to maintain public engagement and justify astronomical budgets. In this high-pressure climate, cosmetic fluidity becomes a highly marketable commodity, allowing publishers to showcase hyper-realistic promotional material that satisfies the immediate visual appetite of mainstream audiences. However, this pursuit of superficial fidelity often comes at the direct expense of systemic depth, mechanical complexity, and narrative consequence. By prioritizing an infinite loop of procedurally generated content smoothed over by a layer of generative AI, the industry risks creating games that are vast and visually flawless, yet completely devoid of the deep interactive friction and emotional equity that defined the classic eras of game design. Ultimately, the enduring debate surrounding neural rendering highlights a profound philosophical division regarding what the medium of video games should fundamentally prioritize. One path leads toward a future where games operate as passive, cinematic landscapes, exquisite corporate-managed theme parks, where the player's agency is minimized to protect a meticulously curated AI-generated visual presentation. The alternative path demands a return to first principles design, where the core of the experience is anchored to absolute responsiveness, deep structural choice, and mechanical integrity. To prevent the medium from devolving into a collection of beautiful but unresponsive generative illusions, both consumers and developers must aggressively push back against the uncritical adoption of cosmetic shortcuts. The industry must remember that a high frame count is completely meaningless if it is decoupled from the physical reality of the player's actions, and that true immersion is born not from the flawless predictive math of a graphics processor, but from the raw, uncompromised agency of the person holding the controller.